I stood at the edge of the hallway, still wearing black, still holding the boutonniere they took off Harold's jacket at the cemetery. I hadn't even changed shoes yet. The house had already changed owners, at least in their minds. Ryland's voice cut through the noise like a glass hitting the floor. "Don't expect a dime from Dad's 40 million, he laughed. "Is she even breathing? We should check." They all chuckled. Callie didn't even look up from her phone. Champagne bottles hissed open in the kitchen. I could hear the thunk of drawers being pulled out, the slap of bright orange stickers pressed onto furniture. Each one had a name scribbled in permanent marker: Julia Eric Callie's mom. None said Mom. None said Corliss. My chair in the dining room, the one Harold sanded and painted for our 25th anniversary, was gone, replaced with a dented metal folding one from the garage. The good plates were out, though. Of course they were. I'd polished them the day before the stroke. I moved quietly, not saying a word, not wanting to be part of the performance. Callie passed me in the hall holding a measuring tape. "We're thinking of knocking out the back wall and adding an outdoor kitchen," she said, like I was a neighbor, not the woman who once washed her bedsheets when she went into labor early. I stepped into the study and closed the door behind me. It still smelled faintly of leather and pine cleaner. The corner shelf held Harold's cigar box collection untouched, probably because no one thought they had resale value. From my coat pocket, I pulled out the thick envelope. I hadn't opened it since the day Harold handed it to me after his second surgery. "In case I'm not around to explain myself," he'd said. I hadn't had the heart to read it. Until now. By dinner, I was seated in the mudroom balancing a paper plate on my lap while they toasted to renovations. The plate they handed me was heavy with dry chicken hard potatoes and a scoop of something gray they called stuffing. Callie's youngest daughter set it on my lap without meeting my eyes. "It's better in here," she said. "Quieter. You'll be more comfortable." The mudroom smelled like bleach and old boots. A mop leaned against the corner next to a cracked bucket. I balanced the plate on my knees and tried to steady my hands. Through the cracked door, I could hear laughter, silverware clinking glasses raised the sound of future plans being made with my past. She built soup. My granddaughter giggled. He built an empire. They roared. I sat very still. The envelope in my coat pocket had left a crease in my palm. I pressed my hand against it, felt the sting of the paper cuts where I'd clutched it too tightly. They didn't notice. No one looked in my direction, not even to ask if I needed water. Just like no one had looked when Harold and I signed the first trust documents over a decade ago. He had needed collateral. The business was drowning, and no one else had stepped up. I did. Quietly. Sold the heirloom necklace my mother gave me. Liquidated the savings account we were keeping for a retirement trip we never took. I signed the form as co-founder. He submitted it as if he had written every line. Later, when they praised his bold pivot, I made soup. When they toasted his turnaround, I changed the linens in the guest room. It didn't matter. It wasn't about the credit. It was about keeping the lights on, keeping the family whole. But now I could hear them picking out paint colors for rooms I'd dusted for 30 years. I heard Callie joke that they'd rip out the old curtains before the will was even cold. I swallowed a bite of chicken. It tasted like nothing. They thought I didn't remember. They thought I didn't matter, but the envelope in my pocket said otherwise. And the lawyer Harold trusted more than anyone had always taken my calls. 15 years ago, Harold came home late. Face pale, silence heavy on his shoulders. He didn't have to say it. The numbers had stopped making sense. The contracts were stalling. The clients were backing out. The company was sinking faster than he could plug the holes. He poured himself a drink and never touched it. Just stood at the window, staring out like answers might bloom on the lawn. "We just need a little more time," he whispered. "One investor. One deal. They want liquidity fast. We don't have it." I nodded and went to our bedroom. I didn't cry, didn't pace. I opened the old cedar box at the back of my closet and took out my mother's wedding pearls. Then the engagement bracelet he'd given me when he still brought home violets. Finally, from the hem of my childhood coat, I unpicked the lining to retrieve the gold brooch my grandmother had smuggled across an ocean. By morning, I'd sold it all. Quietly, carefully, no fuss. I wired the funds with my name on the memo line and left the receipt in my sock drawer. 2 days later, the merger papers were signed. Harold was hailed a genius, a man who beat the odds, a visionary. He asked once where the money had come from. I kissed his cheek and said, "Don't ask." He didn't. That was our deal. He stood in front. I held the ground behind him. I never wanted a plaque. I wanted his name to survive the storm. And it did. But now, standing in front of the mailbox that bore only his name, I watched as my granddaughter scraped it off with her fingernail, laughing that the house needed updating anyway. They didn't know how many nights I stayed up writing business proposals in pen, cross-legged at the kitchen table. They didn't know how many times I'd swallowed pride so someone else could look bold. They just wanted my parking space, my bedroom, my spot at the table. And as I watched the mailbox blank out beneath her chipped manicure, I realized something. It wasn't about credit anymore. It was about erasure. Harold had been pacing the den, rubbing his temples like he could squeeze brilliance out of pressure. The IPO model wasn't coming together. The board was restless. One wrong move, and they'd back out. "I don't know what they want anymore," he muttered. "They say it's outdated. Safe. Stale." I waited until he fell asleep with a spreadsheet still open on his lap. Then I eased out of bed, turned the kettle on low, and warmed a heating pad for my hip. At the kitchen table, I opened a blank pad and began writing. I didn't overthink. I just wrote. The structure, the language, the projections. It came back faster than I expected, like old muscle memory. Before I was a wife. Before I was a mother. Back when I had an office of my own and a business card with raised lettering. 3 hours later, my hands were sore and the tea was cold, but the model was complete. I signed it L. Haver, an old pen name I'd once used for mock proposals in school. The next morning, I printed it out, sealed it in an envelope, and walked to the post box 3 streets over. No return address. Just the company's name on the front. Harold brought it home 2 days later, waving it like treasure. It came in anonymously. "Can you believe that this thing's sharp? The board loves it. They're already calling it the pivot we needed." I nodded and smiled, folding laundry as he talked. He never guessed. They hung a framed version in the lobby a month after the IPO closed. A little brass plaque underneath read, "Inspired by ingenuity." For years, I didn't care that no one asked who wrote it. But now, listening to Callie joke about converting my room into a spa, watching Rylan lead a tour through the house like a real estate agent, I knew I had to say something without raising my voice. The day they moved me into the laundry room, Callie smiled like she was doing me a favor. "You'll have more privacy here," she said, stacking my slippers beside the dryer. "And it's closer to the guest bath." They gave my bedroom to Callie's sister, who arrived 2 days early with 4 suitcases and a complaint about the sheets. That night, once the house had gone quiet, I sat on the edge of the washer and waited. I knew the creaks in the floor by memory, the ones that gave you away, and the ones that didn't. I took the small screwdriver I'd hidden in my travel kit and wedged it beneath the warped board under the mop sink. The nails lifted with barely a sound. Underneath the leather folder I hadn't touched in over a decade, it was all still there. Every original draft of the IPO model, the financial breakdowns, the investment ledger I'd kept in my own hand, the patent registration notarized and tied to my pseudonym L. Haver. My hands didn't shake as I zipped it into my old canvas purse. They hadn't earned the right to make me tremble. By morning, I was out the back door before anyone noticed. I walked 4 blocks to the pharmacy, waited for the couple ahead of me to finish buying toothpaste, then stepped into the phone booth near the vending machines. I dialed the number I'd memorized years ago, but never needed Harold's lawyer, Dorset. When he picked up, I said only, "It's time." He paused for just a moment, then bring it all in. The walk to his office was longer than I remembered. But my steps didn't falter. I passed the bank Harold once pitched to the corner cafe, where I used to outline projections on napkins, the bench where I waited while he met with investors. And when I walked into Mr. Dorset's office and laid the folder on his desk, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not pride, not power, just a kind of quiet steadiness. He opened it, read for a few minutes, then said, "Let's make it official." The analyst arrived just after lunch, a thin man with round glasses and a briefcase that clicked sharply when he set it on the table. He didn't waste time with introductions. Mr. Dorset handed him the folder, and he began comparing the drafts to the sample signatures I'd provided. He studied the loops, the slant, the pressure of each stroke. He even checked the way my pen sometimes paused before a downward line. It was strange watching someone measure the parts of me I'd tried so hard to keep hidden. After nearly an hour, he looked up. "It's a match," he said, "not partial. Full." He tapped the edge of the oldest proposal. Whoever wrote these did so with intention. She knew exactly what she was doing. Mr. Dorset nodded, satisfied. He pulled out the next set of papers. Copyright confirmations, patent filings, the original registration for the stabilization model. Each document bore the same pseudonym, each linked directly to me. "What about the royalties?" he asked the analyst. The man flipped through the ledger. "They've been accruing for years, untouched." He glanced at me. "You understand the amount we're talking about?" I did. But money wasn't the weight pressing against my ribs. It was the thought of Ryland's voice echoing through the house, calling me useless, calling Harold the only builder in the family. "I don't want the income," I said quietly. "I want the ownership noted. Before they box me up with the rest of the things they think are outdated." Mr. Dorset slid a declaration across the desk. I read it, once then signed. The ink spread cleanly across the page, steady and sure, my name, my work, my hand. He gathered the documents into a fresh folder, one marked for court. Then he leaned back, and for the first time in 10 years, he smiled at me. "They won't be expecting this," he said. "But the court will." I exhaled slowly, feeling something loosen in my chest, something old and long pinned down. And as he prepared the final packet, I realized the house I'd left that morning would not be the same one I returned to. We sat in the conference room just past 9. The long oak table was polished to a shine, its surface already set with thick folders and glasses of water no one touched. Ryland slouched in his chair, Callie beside him, arms crossed like she'd been inconvenienced. The lawyer's assistant offered coffee. I declined. I'd already had mine alone before the sun came up in the silence of a borrowed room. Mr. Dorset began with the standard language, last will and testament, lawful heirs executed in full mental capacity. Ryland smirked. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Your father left something else." He pressed play on the small recorder resting beside the folders. Harold's voice crackled to life, warm, unmistakable, and clear. "If my son speaks ill of his mother, he said subtract $500,000 per insult. You'll know how many." A moment of stunned silence followed. Then Mr. Dorset slid a transcript across the table. Every insult, every word caught by the home's smart assistant days after the funeral. The system had been recording by default. It picked up everything. She's barely useful anymore. She just makes soup. Harold was the brain. She was the apron. Each sentence dated. Each line time-stamped. Ryland's face went pale. "This is a joke," he muttered. Mr. Dorset didn't reply. He simply turned the page, outlining the adjustments. 6 documented insults, 3 million deducted. Callie opened her mouth, then closed it. I reached into my purse without a word. Slowly, deliberately, I placed the small patent certificate on the center of the table. The one with the model number. The one still in my name. No one reached for it. No one said anything. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to remind them of the ideas that carried the company through its darkest years, or the drafts they'd praised without knowing who had written them. I simply sat back in my chair, listening as Mr. Dorset moved on to the next clause, where my name, full and unabridged, appeared again. Mr. Dorset cleared his throat and opened a separate folder thinner than the rest, but weighted by something heavier than paper. He slid it across the table until it rested in front of Rylan. "This," he said, "is the registered patent tied to the financial stabilization model used during the company's IPO." Rylan glanced down without interest until he saw the name. L. Haver. He read aloud, confused. Mr. Dorset nodded. Pseudonym. But the handwriting analysis, notarized statements, and original drafts confirm authorship. The name now legally traces to Mrs. Corliss Haverford. The room stilled. He flipped the next page. Royalties were never drawn. They've been accruing since the year following the IPO. He named the number aloud. Millions. Quiet, compounded millions. A gasp escaped from someone across the table. I didn't turn to see who. Callie muttered almost to herself, "She's just a housewife." Mr. Dorset raised his eyes to mine. "The court sees otherwise." I adjusted my posture and finally spoke. "You saw soup. He saw stock value. I saw survival." No one replied. For all their noise, for all their forward strides and loud opinions, they hadn't seen the foundation beneath their feet. They'd taken each meal, each sacrifice, each whispered decision, and packed it away with the linens as if it wouldn't matter when it counted. But now it counted. Mr. Dorset laid out the terms: adjusted distributions, royalty claims, and a reallocation of assets tied to intellectual property. I was no longer listed as a dependent. I was listed as originator, contributor, and owner. Callie looked stunned. Rylan stared like he didn't recognize the room. And in that moment, I realized they didn't recognize me either. Not truly. They had never learned how I held the seams together, how I paid attention when no one asked me to, how I wrote what their father couldn't, because someone had to. Mr. Dorset turned the final page, and there, in clear print, underlined in blue, was the part that brought the silence to its sharpest point. The ownership of the house was never transferred to Rylan. It had remained in my name the entire time. The notice went out before noon. 48 hours. That was the time the court required, and I didn't see a reason to extend it. The deed was clear. My name, not his. It had always been my name. By evening, the hallway was a maze of half-packed boxes and open suitcases. The same children who once taped neon stickers on everything they wanted were now stumbling over piles of their own things, arguing about what to leave and what to grab. Callie was on the phone with someone. Her mother, maybe whispering furiously, as if keeping her voice low might change the facts. Rylan stood near the staircase, red-eyed, and shaking his hands, opening and closing, like he wasn't sure whether to clench or reach for something. "Mom, please," he said. "Just let us figure this out. We didn't know." I looked at him, the man who used to run into my arms when storms rattled the windows, the boy who once carried a wooden airplane Harold carved for him everywhere he went. But his voice now belonged to someone else, someone who had forgotten where he came from. "You spoke first," I said. The will listened. He flinched like the words hit a bruise. When the last box left the foyer, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. The stickers still clung to the furniture, bright and smug, as if ink could carve ownership deeper than memory. I peeled each one away, the yellow one on the oak dresser, the orange one on the armchair where Harold used to read, the green one stuck crooked on the silver frame of our wedding photo. They came off easily, softer adhesive than I expected. I dropped them all into the fireplace, watched the colors curl and blacken, until nothing remained but ash. By the time the embers dimmed, the house felt different. Quiet, steady, stripped of claims that were never real. I stood in the doorway, listening to the stillness settle over the rooms, and knew the next step wouldn't be about them anymore. I sold the house in April. Not out of anger, not to make a point. I sold it because it didn't feel like mine anymore, not with the echoes they left behind. Even empty, it still whispered their laughter, their schemes, their blind certainty that I would always stay small. The buyers were a quiet couple with 2 children and a dog that kept trying to chase the wind. They loved the porch. I didn't tell them anything about the fireplace. I found a small cottage near the coast, tucked just beyond a row of wind-bent trees. The air tasted like salt. The mornings were mine. Every footstep inside was mine. The stillness belonged to no one else. With the royalties, what they once thought was nothing, I funded a scholarship through a foundation I set up myself. I used pseudonyms. One of them L. Haver, another C.E. Haverford. I didn't want plaques or ceremonies, just names called at graduation that had once been overlooked. I still drank tea the same way I did that night at the kitchen table years ago, black, no sugar. I still used the same mug, the one Harold brought back from a conference in Chicago, chipped at the rim but perfectly balanced. On the mantel sat the framed blueprint of the IPO model, the original draft. Same curves, same scrawled notes. But now in the corner was my signature, no alias, no disguise, just mine. Clear and final. Every so often I lit a small candle beside it. Not in mourning, not in memory, but as a kind of vow. That quiet doesn't mean absence. That silence isn't surrender. That what grows in the background can take root deeper than the noise up front. I sat by the window with a blanket across my lap, tea in hand, and listened to the gulls call across the sky. No door would open behind me. No voices would crowd the hall. Just the wind, the waves, and a home where every name had finally been spoken.